By August or September, it's very likely we're at $38 trillion in debt. At the same time, treasury yields on across the curve, whether you're talking bills on the short term or bonds for the long term, yields are approaching or at 5%. Do the math. I mean, you're going to blink and we're going to be paying $1.8 trillion a year just in interest on the debt. Fed is overtly political. That's why they hate Donald Trump. If you look at the campaign contributions, for example, of people at the Fed, I'm sorry, you cannot tell me this is some kind of apolitical or nonpartisan institution or that they're data dependent. Please.
Hello and welcome to Soar Financially, a channel where we discuss the macro to understand the micro. My name is Kai Hoffman, and of course, I'm your host of this channel, and I'm looking forward to introducing a first-time guest. It's E.J. Antoni. And I've written it down because I want to get it correct, he's the Chief Economist and Richard Astor Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget. Just based on that title, I'm sure you can assume where the discussion is going. We need to talk about the massive deficits the U.S. is accruing here, but also how are we trying to get out of this? The big, beautiful bill, of course, is one big topic. Tariffs, inflation are others that we will be touching on. So lots to discuss with my guest. But before I switch over, hit that like and subscribe button. It's a free way to support our channel, and it means a lot to us. So thanks so much for doing that. Now, EJ, this is a great pleasure to welcome you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, 100%. Really looking forward to the discussion here. But before we dive into some of the details, EJ, run us a bit through who and what is the Heritage Foundation so we can sort of get an understanding of where you're coming from.
Oh, I'd be happy to. We're a public policy organization, the largest think tank, the largest conservative think tank in the country. And we focus on not just financial issues, although we certainly do that. We handle the fiscal and the monetary side, but we also cover social issues as well. So really runs the gamut of all kinds of political issues. And again, we focus on the public policy side. We have a tremendous number of supporters, unlike some think tanks that are really just have one or two corporate backers. We have the largest number of supporters in the entire country, and we get a surprisingly small amount, like 1% of our annual operating revenue from big corporations. So it is in a lot of ways a grassroots organization, although we have supporters from across the income spectrum, if you will. The organization's over 50 years old now, I'm proud to say, and still going strong. We work with all kinds of politicians. Doesn't matter if they are Republican or Democrat, although obviously it's usually only the conservative ones that like to listen to us. But we're more than happy to speak to anybody about our research. And in that sense, we really are, I guess, kind of an educational organization where we do research on public policy and then we present it to politicians to try to advise them on how best to help their constituents.
No, fantastic, EJ. I really appreciate the overview. Helps us understand where you're coming from. A lot of research on policy, which we will have to talk about the big, beautiful bill here in a minute. But we got to draw or paint a macroeconomic picture first. You said you're following monetary and fiscal policies here. Let's maybe get a summary first. What's the economic situation right now? How would you interpret that?
Oh, it's a bit of a mess. I think a lot of things are heading in the right direction finally, but that's not to say everything is okay. I liken it to over the last 4 years, we've basically been heading in the wrong direction and at full throttle. We have finally taken our foot off the gas and we are stomping hard on the brake. But it's going to take a while to slow this thing down, right? It's going to take a while to get rid of all that momentum and to not only finally come to a stop, but to then put it in reverse and to start backtracking, to start regaining some of our lost prosperity. That's going to take time, unfortunately. So things are headed in the right direction, but I think we also need to be honest about our current assessment. We are still in a cost of living crisis that didn't magically change simply because a couple of the policies in DC started to change. It took a while to get us here. It's going to take a while to get us out. We didn't magically hit $36.2 trillion in debt overnight, right? That took several years. And again, it's going to take several years to unwind that. And in some instances, it's going to be darn near impossible. You can't unring the bell or put the toothpaste back in the tube, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use. That's not to say that we can't make things better, but we also have to be realistic in some ways and realize certain things are not going to go back to the status quo ante.
Yeah, no, 100% there, EJ. And maybe we'll need to identify the problem first. It sounds like a little bit redundant, of course, because everybody's aware of the debt situation. But like, how did we get here before we talk about solutions or the process of even trying to find a solution here? So what's the problem? Like, or where did it start?
It really started here in DC with the runaway profligate government spending. And we should point out too, this, although Biden obviously gets a lot of blame for it, this was not exclusively a Democrat problem. There were certainly some big multi-trillion dollar spending bills that passed during the Biden administration without any Republican support. Sure, that's true. However, there were also some bills that passed with Republican support as well, where they would not have been able to get those across the finish line without Senate Republicans jumping on board just because of the Senate filibuster and the way the rules work in that chamber. So let's be clear. There are big spenders on both sides of the aisle. Just because there are many more on the Democrat side doesn't mean the Republican Party is blameless here. I mean, for crying out loud, we even have a term for those folks, rhino, Republican in name only. So clearly, just because you're just because you have an R behind your name doesn't mean you're actually a fiscal conservative by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, again, the runaway government spending is really what got us here. It was all of that spending that prompted the Fed to print all of those trillions of dollars that gave us the runaway inflation, which then in turn gave us the fastest interest rate hikes in 40 years, which also gave us a regional bank crisis. And it was that deadly combination of not only a very rapid rise in interest rates, but a very rapid rise in inflation rates. That combo gave us a completely unaffordable housing market, arguably the most unaffordable in American history when we look at things like income levels. And the result of that is an overall cost of living crisis, which again, we're still in today. If you look at, I think, measures that really impact the American people much more than something like GDP, which frankly is kind of a guess as to the size of the economy. There are good reasons why we measure it the way we do, but there are good criticisms of it as well. So put the official metrics like that aside for a second. Look at something that I think is a much better illustration of the average American's actual financial situation. What is the typical American family facing today? Look at what the average weekly paycheck actually buys. That measure went down 4% under the Biden administration. Conversely, now under Trump, it's up about 1.3% in just a few months, which is really remarkable when you think about it. But that gives you, I think, a better picture than something like GDP of how the actual typical American family is really doing today. Now, again, you're only up about 1%. There's a lot of lost ground to make up. You haven't simply wiped away the Biden years in a few months, but you are moving in the right direction. You are regaining that lost ground, and I think that's a good thing.
Give me 60 seconds and I'll show you why you should be buying silver and how to get started. Continuing price spikes in groceries, healthcare, and housing tell the story of inflation, and almost everyone is seeing their dollar purchase less every year. As the reality of inflation sinks in, investors are acting to diversify and protect themselves, their families, and their savings. That's why Money Metals is offering a silver starter kit to help you get started in holding tangible wealth. This mix of our most recommended forms of silver includes 9 silver coins, totaling 4 troy ounces of pure silver. These silver coins are popular and widely recognized, making them easy to sell back for cash too. Low transaction costs and transparent pricing are among the reasons Investopedia calls Money Metals the best precious metals dealer in America. Don't waste any more time. Start protecting your savings today with physical silver at moneymetals.com/go.
No, absolutely. Disinflation to a certain degree is welcome because, as you said, things have just gotten way out of hand in certain areas in particular. Let's talk about those disinflationary drivers, though. What is bringing drivers down? Is it policy? Is it the commodity market? Curious, like what your thoughts are on that, DJ.
Well, we have a couple of things that are really moving in the right direction here. Not the least of which is that for the first time in years, when we do look at those GDP calculations, we dive in and look at government purchases, specifically what we oftentimes call government spending, although that's a misnomer. Government spending is a much broader category. It includes things like transfer payments, like welfare. So in the GDP report, it's government purchases. And that actually declined in the first quarter of this year. For the first time in years. That's great news. As government spends less, it needs to borrow less. That puts downward pressure on the loanable funds market and on the Federal Reserve. That has helped to slow inflation. At the same time, we've essentially ended the federal government's war on reliable domestic energy production, whether that's coal or oil or natural gas. We have sent a clear signal now to energy markets that we have no intention of shutting them down anymore. We have no intention of getting us off of oil and of natural gas anytime soon. And we no longer have any intention, unlike Obama and Biden, of trying to put coal producers out of business. And the result has been more product being brought to market and more critical maintenance of long-term components, things like refineries. Critical parts of the energy supply chain. All of that is helping put downward pressure on energy prices as production is set to ramp up. And sure enough, the average price of energy is down about 2.5% now compared to when Trump took office. Very, very good sign there, because not only does that affect certain commodity prices that consumers buy directly, like the utility price of electricity or the utility price of natural gas, gasoline at the pump, but it also affects prices throughout the economy. I think we really underestimate, Kai, just how much energy affects the price of everything we do and everything we buy. And it's not just because energy is an input throughout the economy. Like when you go and you grab a gallon of milk off the store shelf, the grocer had to put that gallon of milk on the store shelf before you took it off. And the grocer paid for that milk, and part of the cost of that milk was the truck driver bringing it there to the grocery store, which obviously used diesel fuel. So all of that is true, but also we use things like natural gas to produce almost all of the synthetic fertilizer in this country. Synthetic fertilizer is one of the biggest cost inputs for farmers. So if you want to bring down food prices, you bring down natural gas prices. And sure enough, we're doing that. So there are both direct and indirect ways in which energy prices affect countless other prices throughout the economy. So you bring down the price of so ubiquitous an input across the market, and sure enough, you will bring down other prices too. And that has helped create not just disinflationary pressures. You're absolutely right on that. In some instances, though, it has been enough to create deflationary pressures where, again, you aren't just slowing the rate of increase, but you're actually decreasing certain prices. And sure enough, when you look at the wholesale price level in May versus January, it hasn't budged. It's literally flat. I mean, that's tremendous news, because although some things have gone up in price, other things have gone down, the average is zero. Wholesale prices tend to, not always, but they tend to lead consumer prices. In other words, what is happening with wholesale prices today ends up happening with consumer prices tomorrow. So we can anticipate these really good inflation numbers that we've seen the last few months to continue. Again, great news for the consumer on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. The cost of living, decrease, massive impact for everybody. But I do have to drill down just a little bit more on the government purchases. You said they were declining. The question is that because of policy, meaning the debt ceiling debate, DOGE? I just want to drill down on that a little bit more. What has been driving that? And if it's, something we can count on going forward as well, or that just was a one-time effect there, EJ?
I think we can count on it going forward. Now, you mentioned DOGE. A lot of it did have to do actually with the effects of DOGE, which, again, I think is a great thing. It's great to bring efficiency to government. We should remember, for all the critics of DOGE, the E doesn't stand for elimination. The E stands for efficiency, the Department of Government Efficiency, not the Department of Government Elimination. Now, sometimes efficiency does mean eliminating things that aren't efficient, but again, that's a good thing. We applaud when a business gets rid of unnecessary employees or inefficient employees. We applaud a business when they get rid of inefficient procedures and processes. That's a good thing. And the same thing for a consumer. When a consumer starts increasing the efficiency in their own life, reducing wasteful spending, that's a path. That's a path to sound budgeting, right? It's the exact same thing with government, and especially in an economy today where we have literally millions of unfilled job openings. I think it's really good when people move out of unproductive public sector jobs and they move into productive private sector ones, especially in the case of jobs that we've been trying to fill for years. So I have to applaud the phenomenal work that DOGE has done, and I think that they will continue doing. They're helping to bring down the headcount at the federal government, so much so that the federal workforce, just exclude the postal service for a second, so just the federal bureaucrats, those jobs have actually declined every single month this year. That's a great sign.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch because we're always getting distracted by the noise that is happening around Doge. For example, we've had the spat between Elon Musk and President Trump, of course, that always takes away from the message and from the main signal here, which is a bit frustrating to see sometimes, because as you said, some good work is being done and efficiencies are being increased here. EJ, you used the word deflation, and I have to follow up on that because deflation is not necessarily good, especially when I look at economic growth. People wait for prices to fall even further before they make a purchase or something like that, just as an example. How do we categorize deflation? And there's always a deflation versus inflation debate. How do we balance that?
Sure. In terms of how do we balance it, let's take that last question first. We don't. The central planning has never worked in terms of monetary policy, and it never will, because how can a single bureaucrat or even a board of a dozen bureaucrats, how on earth are they supposed to know what the price of money should be, what the price of capital should be? How on earth are they supposed to know what the overall price level should be, if there even is such a thing? How on earth do you calculate that? How on earth are you supposed to know what those numbers should be? Second, the idea that deflation is always and everywhere bad is really a fiction. Almost always it's a good thing. It's either a sign of the economy healing or it's a sign of technological progress. In the first instance, we look at deflation during economic recessions or even depressions, and we think, oh no, the deflation is causing the problem. No, the deflation is actually a sign of the economy healing. It was the inflation during the so-called boom that was the problem, right? It was the government creating too much money, or the banking system artificially expanding the money supply with loans that had no backing. Those were the things that artificially caused the money supply to increase and the economy to overheat, and sent false price signals to market participants as to what the actual economy was really doing. The result of that ultimately is the boom transitions to a bust. But at that point, as market participants realize what prices really should be, the prices start declining. Again, that's a return to equilibrium. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. The bad thing was the artificial boom, not the actual bust. But unfortunately, we look at what's happening in real time and we say, okay, right now, the economy is contracting. That's a bad thing. And what's happening right now is prices are falling. It must be the falling prices that are causing the contracting economy. QED deflation is bad. That's just simply not the case. It really is a sign of the economy healing. It's kind of like if you have cancer, the bad thing is the cancer. The bad thing is not the symptoms that come from chemotherapy and radiation. Those aren't pleasant, but they're a side effect of the healing process, if you will. So aside from that boom bust cycle, you do have, even under stable monetary policy, you will, from technological progress, see very slight deflation over time. From essentially the time of the nation's founding until the Federal Reserve, which wasn't created until 1913, you had very slight deflation over time. And the reason for that was steady technological progress. And that brought down costs for consumers. And the result was slightly falling prices. It wasn't some kind of catastrophic drop, but over the years, it was an annualized rate of a fraction of a percent, which again is a good thing, because it means that there is technological progress that is slowly over time bringing down the cost of living.
Well, we're seeing that progress in the aspects of AI as well, but I'm not sure how that's really reflected in the overall pricing and what that will do. Of course, cost of goods or the laptop I'm using will always drop. That's just the law of advancement, I guess, or there's a certain name for the law, I guess, as well. But maybe EJ, just to sum that discussion up, like what are your inflation expectations then? It's funny that the term is actually called inflation expectation, not deflation expectations or anything like that. So I'm curious, what is your forecast now for the CPI number, the official numbers moving forward?
I think we're going to actually start trending towards that 2% target, which we really never were under the Biden administration. I understand you did have a short period towards the end there where the index got a 2 handle. But if you look at the monthly changes, this is really remarkable. You can look at the monthly changes of the CPI from the end of the Great Recession, June of 2009, all the way through the end of 2020 before Biden took office. And during that time period, the index was the annualized increase in the index was 1.8%. Okay, but there are some pretty significant deviations above and below that trend line where you see spikes, you see dips. Some of that has to do with things like the fracking revolution, et cetera. But whatever the case, under Biden, the CPI for the first 18 months rose at a remarkably consistent 8.6% annualized rate. In other words, you can draw that trend line up, and there really aren't many deviations from it. It's a pretty darn steady rate of increase. Likewise, after that first 18 months, so the next 30 months under Biden, the CPI rose at a remarkably consistent monthly rate. In other words, the monthly deviations from that trend were not that big. And sure enough, it was well over 3% at an annualized rate. So this idea that we were ever trending towards the 2% target, I mean, it was a fiction. Conversely, look at what the monthly increases have done this year in 2025. After January, they have been very, very low. And so we're running at an annualized rate of about 1.4%. That's great news. It means that what's happening in terms of the monthly change is pointing to a trend towards the 2% target. Phenomenal news. I think we're going to continue heading there, again, because a lot of the economic forces right now are pointing in the right direction. But like we started this conversation, this is a freight train. It has a lot of momentum, and it will take time to slow it down before you can actually put it in reverse and get it moving in the other direction. That being said, all of the pressures are in the right, are in the right direction.
When you're, I wouldn't say advocating for deflation here, but you're witnessing a deflation, obviously here. One argument against deflation, of course, which is always negative, is like, oh, it will lead to a recession. Like, what is your answer to that? And what is your current recession? What are your current recession odds that you're using?
Well, there's a very easy, I think, temporal argument before you even get into any of the theory, part of which we already covered. But before you even start talking about theory, there's a simple temporal argument against the idea that deflation causes recessions, which is that the economy starts contracting before prices start falling. That's very, very clear when you look at the record of history. So this whole idea that somehow it's the deflation that causes the recession, I mean, it's just simply not true. And when you think about it from a standpoint of these technological advancements that cause prices to fall, what ends up happening is those technological advancements bring down costs for consumers, and consumers can now buy the same stuff they did before and yet have money left over, which means they go out and they do even more spending. And so what we observe, sure enough, during those times of technological progress, although you may see what you might call recessions in specific industries, you don't see overall recessions in the broader economy. For example, when technological progress like Henry Ford's assembly line made the automobile essentially mainstream, turned it from a luxury product to something that the common man could afford, what did that do? Well, it caused the horse and carriage industry to go into a steep recession, and it essentially continued until that industry went kaput. But it made the American consumer much better off. It reduced transportation costs for the American consumer, and that left the American consumer with more money to spend on other products, which led to booms in other industries.
I think you used the term in one of your papers, I believe, and I might be stealing it, but short-term pain versus long-term gain, I think, is the
Mhm.
theme here. And we're seeing that in many other factors. We've seen a lot of shock and awe, a lot of executive orders being issued over the first 100 days. It seems like we're a bit in a deal-making phase now. How much more short-term pain are you expecting, meaning like announcements out of the blue or just volatility, perhaps, before the long-term gain? Maybe we'll start on the short-term focus, and then we'll make our way to the long-term gain here.
Oh, I think in terms of volatility, we're going to have that for quite some time. I think 2025 is gonna be a red letter year for for those volatility levels. In terms of that short term pain, a lot of that is hopefully going to be isolated to the official statistics. For example, when we look at the jobs numbers, they've been artificially bloated by hiring government bureaucrats. When we look at the GDP numbers, they've been artificially bloated by government purchases, that government spending. Just one example, in I think it was September of 2024, so right before the election, if we look at the household survey, the number of respondents who said that they were employed by the government exploded in a single month now by 700,000. And since this is the household survey, this is where we get the unemployment rate from. So instead of the unemployment rate rising several tenths of a percentage point, it fell several tenths of a percentage point that month because so many people reported that they were now working for the government. Okay, great. That made your statistic look good. The unemployment rate improved instead of getting worse. But how did that improve the broader economy, the real economy? It didn't. It made it worse. You are essentially levying more of a burden on the productive private sector in order to pay for the unproductive public sector to have more employees. That's a bad thing, not a good thing. But sure, it made the statistics look good. We just had, for the first time in several years now, government was no longer the largest annual increase in payrolls. So now this is the establishment survey. Government was no longer the largest increase in terms of annual payrolls, either the first or second largest. It fell to number 3. That's a great sign because the number of public payrolls, that growth has really slowed. I mean, dramatically in just the first few months of this year. It's a sign that the economy is reprivatizing, as the Treasury Secretary likes to say. And I think that's a good term, and it's a good sign for the overall economy. But again, as the government spends less money, as the government hires fewer people, in fact, fires some people, that makes it look like a negative in terms of the official statistics. It reduces GDP, it reduces the jobs numbers, but it's a sign of the economy getting better, not worse.
How much of a shock treatment are we witnessing right now in terms of policy? Like the big beautiful bill is ruffling some feathers, of course, across party lines here. What do you make of that shock treatment, and how successful is it right now if you were to use the first, I don't know, what is it, 120 days now, as a barometer of where things are?
In terms of a shock treatment, look, that's what we need. I'll go back to the cancer analogy if I can. I think we need to really understand what bad shape federal finance was in at the end of 24 and the start of 25, and what bad shape it frankly still is in today. Sure, we have 36.2 trillion in debt, but that's because of the debt ceiling being in effect this entire year. As soon as that's lifted, we're going to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars in a single day. We're going to have a massive issuance of treasury bills because we need to not only replenish the Treasury's cash account, which is at the New York Fed, which has slowly been, getting dipped into in order to pay for all these bills since we can't borrow anymore. At the same time, the Treasury has been using all kinds of extraordinary measures in order to, in order to keep things going. In other words, instead of putting money into things like a trust fund that the Treasury is obliged to do, they've essentially been pausing those payments and using that cash to cover whatever expenses need to go out the door today. All of that has to be unwound. In other words, you're going to need to borrow a lot of money when the debt ceiling is lifted to replenish all of those trust funds and other accounts. What I'm trying to get at here is by August or September, it's very likely we're at $38 trillion in debt. At the same time, Treasury yields on across the curve, whether you're talking bills on the short term or bonds for the long term, yields are approaching or at 5%. do the math. 5% on 38 trillion. I mean, you're going to blink and we're going to be paying $1.8 trillion a year just in interest on the debt. And it gets worse from there. You're fast approaching a point where you're going to be paying 2 trillion in interest. Again, that's just interest. We're just talking about servicing the debt, not roads and bridges, not schools or hospitals or the military or Social Security, just interest. We got to be realistic about how bad the situation is. Okay. Getting back to what you were asking on the big, beautiful bill, is it a step in the right direction? Sure. It slows the rate of increase in terms of the deficit and in terms of the debt. That's a good thing. Does it go far enough? No, it certainly doesn't. Part of that is because politicians just don't have a spine. They're not cutting as much as they should. Part of it is also the mechanics here, though. Chuck Schumer in the Senate is not going to give you any help on anything. He's going to do everything he can to throw up roadblocks and prevent a conservative agenda from getting passed. So in terms of certain types of budget cuts, you actually can't do them through the reconciliation process. You're going to have to do them through rescissions. And you also have to worry about things like a debt ceiling increase. If you don't do a debt ceiling increase in reconciliation, you're not going to be able to do it any other way, because the only way Chuck Schumer is going to go along with the debt ceiling increase, if it's done through regular order in the Senate, is if he gets a ton of handouts for himself. And that means that you're going to have to increase spending. So, look, I understand why a lot of people oppose the bill, but I think we also have to be realistic about how tied our hands are politically and how you can't cut certain types of spending. You're right. You can only be cutting mandatory spending here. You can't cut discretionary spending. You're going to have to do all that through the rescissions process. Now, look, all that being said, I think the Senate can make the bill better, and I hope they will. I hope they put in more tax cuts. I hope they put in more spending cuts. I hope they accelerate the sunsetting, for example, of the Green New Scam and other, kind of so-called green energy boondoggles, which is what they really are. Again, the Senate can make a lot of improvements, and I hope they do, because we really, really need to get our fiscal house in order. If you don't, you're going to make the last 4 years of inflation look like a walk in the park.
Given what you just said there, EJ, you understand the rift between President Trump and Elon Musk on this topic? Do you understand where Elon and President Trump are coming from, each side?
Sure, absolutely. And look, Elon's right. We have to do a lot more to cut government spending. But I think where Elon goes wrong is he's getting so hyper fixated on this that he's ignoring some of the political realities. And look, that kind of hyper fixation that he does is actually what has made him so successful in running so many different businesses, right? He will not let it go. How do I make this rocket more efficient? So to make SpaceX successful? How do we make the algorithm on the X platform more efficient so that users have a better experience? He finds problems, he hyper fixates on them to such an extent. He's like a bulldog that latches onto something and just won't let go. That has made him incredibly successful in a whole host of other instances. But in politics, that kind of unbending attitude where you refuse to acknowledge the political realities with which you're dealing, that has proven to be problematic. And I think maybe President Trump, who has, although he's not a politician, because he was in New York operating businesses for so long, he knows how to deal with political realities. I think he might be a better suited animal for this fight. That's not a criticism of Elon. Let me be clear. The work Elon has done has been invaluable, but I think Trump just might be the better one to navigate this particular problem, at least in this particular moment.
No, fair enough. Appreciate your opinion on that, EJ. And maybe one last topic I need to get your opinion on is, of course, the FOMC meeting, the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
How do they fit into all of this? Of course, setting policy here for interest rates and all of that. Where do they stand right now? What are your expectations for the Fed, and maybe some orient or give us some ideas, like what do you expect the outcome to be of this FOMC meeting? By the way, we'll be publishing this interview just before the press conference, so tomorrow, so meaning on Wednesday.
Yeah, without any kind of, just truly overwhelming evidence for why we need rate cuts, I don't see this Federal Reserve moving at all. Let's be very, very clear. The Fed hates Donald Trump. And maybe you hate or love Donald Trump. I don't know at the end of the day. Look, I don't love the guy either. I don't hate him, certainly. I like some of his policies. I dislike others. But at the end of the day, whether you love or hate Donald Trump, or even whether you love or hate the Keynesian models that the Federal Reserve uses, it is very clear that those models show a much stronger case for reducing interest rates now than they did back in the fall of 2024. So you have to ask, okay, why did the Fed cut in 2024 right before the election? They did an emergency 0.5 percentage point, a 50 basis point cut. And then they followed it up with 2 quarter percentage point cuts, 2 25 basis point cuts. Why did they slash a whole percentage point back then? And they're doing absolutely nothing now. Why are they sitting on their hands? Well, because the Fed is overtly political. That's why. They hate Donald Trump. If you look at the campaign contributions, for example, of people at the Fed, over 90% of them have donated exclusively to Democrats. I'm sorry, you cannot tell me this is some kind of apolitical or nonpartisan institution, or that they're data dependent. Please, the data have been just crystal clear during much of the Biden administration that the Fed should have been hiking rates much sooner and much faster, and they didn't. They sat on their hands. And then right before the election, again, when there was no empirical justification for cutting rates because inflation was reaccelerating, not trending towards that 2% target, the Fed came in right before the election and did a huge rate cut. And now all of a sudden that Trump is back in office, now we're no longer talking about 6 rate cuts in 2025, which is what they were saying in the fall of 24. Now we're just saying, well, we have to wait and see. There's too much uncertainty. Tariffs might cause inflation, blah, 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 blah. The labor market softening has definitely accelerated. Inflation has decelerated. Again, if you look at the Keynesian models, which I don't even necessarily believe in, but if you do, that's what the Fed says they believe in, there is much more of a case to cut interest rates today than there was 6 months ago. I see no reason other than politics for why the Fed is not moving. Again, that's not even an assessment of the Fed should or shouldn't cut rates from a monetarist perspective or from an Austrian perspective. It's simply saying that by the Fed's own standards, they are seriously messing up here.
Now, it's interesting opinion there. Really appreciate you sharing that with us, EJ. And I've got like 5 last minute or rapid fire questions for you. You can just answer higher or lower. Again, not investment advice or anything. I'm just really trying to summarize a little bit where we're at and let our viewers know where things are trended. 10-year bond yield, EJ, higher or lower at the end of the year?
Oh, at the end of the year compared to today?
Yeah, let's do that. 6 months roughly.
Yeah, I would suspect slightly higher.
Okay. Inflation, higher or lower?
I think slightly lower.
US dollar, Dixie, higher or lower?
Probably slightly lower.
S&P 500, roughly 6,000, higher or lower?
Oof, too many factors there. I'll tell you this just from the broker that I work with. He's right now in a neutral position. So just to tell you where I'm coming from, I think it's I wouldn't be comfortable putting money on either end of that bet. Sorry.
The last one was a bit rhetorical. Interest rates.
Yeah, I don't see them budging either. I think we're gonna be stuck with a Fed funds rate where it is.
No, fantastic. EJ, really appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you so much for answering our questions, and thanks for putting some mindset around what is happening in Washington right now. How can we make sense of all of this? EJ, where can we send our audience to follow more of your work?
Oh, best place to follow me is going to be on Twitter or X, whatever we call it these days. The handle there is @RealEJ_Antoni.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great pleasure to have you on. Maybe after the next the next 2 FOMC meeting back in September, we should chat again, catch up, see where we stand. So really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for your time. And to everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in to Soar Financially. Hope you enjoyed this conversation here with EJ Antoni. He's the chief economist over at the Heritage Foundation. Really, really insightful what he shared with us, and hope you found it insightful as well. Leave a comment down below, leave a like, and if you haven't done so, hit that subscribe button. It's a free way to support us, and we tremendously appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with lots more here on Soar Financially.